In the late 12th century, a monumental event sent shockwaves across the Christian world, igniting a conflict that would be remembered for generations. The holy city of Jerusalem, a place of immense spiritual significance for Christians, Jews, and Muslims alike, had been under Christian control for nearly a century. This control was the result of the First Crusade, a campaign that carved out several Crusader states in the Levant. However, the balance of power in the region was destined to shift dramatically. A brilliant and unifying leader had risen among the Muslim forces, a man known to history as Salah al-Din or Saladin. He vowed to reclaim Jerusalem for Islam, setting the stage for a clash of civilizations. Saladin was a masterful strategist and a devout leader who had successfully united the fractured Muslim territories surrounding the Crusader kingdoms. His leadership provided a stark contrast to the internal squabbles and political divisions that had weakened the Christian states. In the year 1187 at the Battle of Hattin, Saladin's forces achieved a devastating victory over the Crusader army. He lured them into a barren, waterless landscape and then annihilated them. This victory left the kingdom of Jerusalem virtually defenseless, its military strength shattered. With the path now clear, Saladin marched his army toward the ultimate prize, the city of Jerusalem itself. The siege of Jerusalem was brief. The city, filled with refugees and defended by a small, demoralized garrison, was in no position to withstand a prolonged assault from Saladin's powerful army. Balian of Ibelin, the commander in charge of the city's defense, negotiated a surrender to avoid the kind of brutal massacre that had occurred when the first Crusaders took the city. On October 2, 1187, Saladin entered Jerusalem. He proved to be a merciful conqueror, allowing the city's Christian inhabitants to ransom themselves and leave peacefully, a stark contrast to the bloodshed that had marked the city's capture by Christians 88 years earlier. The news of Jerusalem's fall spread like wildfire across Europe, carried by horrified pilgrims and merchants. Pope Gregory VIII issued a call to arms, urging the kings and knights of Christendom to take up the cross and embark on a new crusade. This was not just a call to reclaim territory, it was a deeply spiritual mission to win back the city where Jesus Christ had walked, taught, and been crucified. The loss was felt as a profound humiliation and a divine punishment. The response was immense, as the most powerful monarchs in Europe prepared to lead their armies to the Holy Land, setting in motion the epic saga known as the Third Crusade. The call for a new crusade was answered by the three most powerful rulers in Western Europe, a gathering of monarchs unprecedented in the history of the Holy Wars. First among them was the venerable Frederick I, the Holy Roman Emperor, known as Barbarossa or Redbeard. At nearly 70 years of age, he was a legendary figure, a veteran of previous campaigns and a symbol of knightly virtue and imperial power. He commanded a massive and well-organized German army, the first to set out on the long and arduous journey eastward. His experience and the sheer size of his force made many believe that his involvement alone would be enough to guarantee the Crusade's success and the swift recapture of Jerusalem. The second monarch to take the cross was Philip II Augustus, the young and cunning king of France. Philip was a shrewd politician, more comfortable in the council chamber than on the battlefield. His primary motivation was often seen as political, a way to assert his authority and expand his influence, both at home and abroad. He was a rival of the English crown, and his participation in the crusade was intertwined with his complex relationship with the King of England. Philip brought a smaller but well-equipped French army, and his presence ensured that France would have a say in the fate of the Holy Land and the spoils of war. The third and perhaps most famous leader of this crusade was Richard I of England, better known as Richard the Lionheart. He had only just inherited the throne from his father Henry II in 1189. Richard was the very embodiment of the chivalric warrior king. He was a brilliant military strategist, a fearless fighter, and a charismatic leader who inspired immense loyalty in his soldiers. For Richard, the crusade was a matter of personal honor and religious duty. He poured the entire resources of his kingdom into funding his massive army and fleet, demonstrating a single-minded determination to confront Saladin and reclaim the Holy City. The dynamic between these three powerful men was fraught with tension from the very beginning. Richard and Philip were historic rivals, their families having fought over lands in France for decades. They swore an oath to cooperate and share all conquests equally, but their deep-seated mistrust simmered just beneath the surface. Frederick Barbarossa, operating independently, represented an older generation of crusading. The combined might of these three kings was formidable. but their personal ambitions and rivalries threatened to undermine their sacred mission before they even reached the shores of the Holy Land, a challenge that would define the course of the entire campaign. Frederick Barbarossa, leading the first and largest contingent of the Third Crusade, chose to take the overland route through Eastern Europe and Anatolia. This was the same path that had been trodden by the armies of the First Crusade, a road known to be fraught with peril. With an army estimated by modern historians to be around 15,000 strong, including 3,000 elite knights, the German force was a disciplined and imposing sight. Frederick's meticulous planning ensured that his army was well supplied as it marched through Hungary. He navigated the complex political landscape of the Balkans, declining alliances against the Byzantine Empire and focusing solely on reaching the Holy Land as quickly as possible. The journey through the Byzantine Empire, however, was not a smooth one. The Byzantine Emperor Isaac II Angelos was deeply suspicious of the massive German army crossing his lands. He feared that Barbarossa might have designs on Constantinople itself. This mistrust led to skirmishes and diplomatic standoffs. Tensions escalated until Barbarossa, frustrated by the delays and hostility, captured the city of Adrianople and threatened the Byzantine capital. This show of force compelled Isaac to cooperate, and in the spring of 1190, the German army was finally ferried across the Hellespont into Asia Minor, the territory of the Seljuk Turks. Once in Anatolia, the Crusaders faced a new set of challenges. Despite having a supposed agreement for safe passage with the Seljuk Sultan, Kilij Arslan II, the German army was subjected to constant harassing attacks from Turkish horsemen. The terrain was harsh, and supplies began to dwindle. Yet, Barbarossa's leadership held the army together. They endured the relentless raids and fought back with disciplined determination, winning a significant victory near Philomelion, and even capturing the Seljuk capital of Iconium, which is modern-day Konya. It seemed as though the emperor's legendary reputation was well earned, and that his formidable army would soon arrive in the Holy Land to turn the tide. But then, disaster struck in a most unexpected way. On June 10, 1190, while crossing the Salif River in southern Anatolia, the great emperor met his end. Accounts differ on the exact circumstances, but most agree that the elderly monarch, perhaps eager to cool himself in the water, was swept away by the current and drowned. The death of their seemingly invincible leader had a devastating effect on the German army. Their morale collapsed. A great number of the soldiers turned back for home, their will to continue broken. A small remnant, led by Barbarossa's son, Frederick of Swabia, pressed on to Acre, but the grand army that was meant to be the vanguard of the crusade had effectively disintegrated. With Frederick Barbarossa's campaign ending in tragedy, the hope of the crusade now rested on the shoulders of King Richard and King Philip. Unlike the German emperor, they chose to travel by sea, a safer but no less complicated route. The English and French forces gathered in France and marched together to the Mediterranean, a public display of unity that masked their deep-seated rivalry. They agreed to set sail from Marseille and rendezvous in Sicily for the winter of 1190 to 1191. This extended stopover, however, would prove to be a test of their already fragile alliance, as their personal and political conflicts began to boil over in the close confines of the island. The situation in Sicily was tense. The local ruler Tancred had imprisoned Richard's sister Joanna, the widow of the previous Sicilian king. Richard, never one to shy away from direct action, demanded her immediate release and the return of her inheritance. When Tancred hesitated and skirmishes broke out between the locals and Richard's soldiers, the English king's patience ran out. He stormed and captured the city of Messina, hoisting his banner over its walls. This aggressive act infuriated Philip, who felt that Richard was overstepping his authority and treating the campaign as his own personal venture rather than a shared enterprise. The rift between the two kings widened further over a matter of marriage. Richard had been betrothed for many years to Philip's sister, Alice. However, Richard had no intention of honoring the agreement, partly due to rumors that Alice had been his own father's mistress. He had already arranged to marry Berengaria of Navarre. During their stay in Sicily, Richard formally broke the engagement. This was a profound personal and political insult to Philip, who felt his family's honor had been slighted. Though a fragile peace was patched together, the trust between the two monarchs was irrevocably broken. Philip, resentful and eager to part ways, sailed for the Holy Land as soon as the winter storm subsided. Richard lingered in Sicily, awaiting the arrival of his bride, Berengaria. This delay, however, would lead to an unexpected chapter in his journey to the Holy Land. As his fleet finally set sail in the spring of 1191, it was scattered by a violent storm. Several ships, including the one carrying his sister Joanna and his fiancée Berengaria, were shipwrecked on the island of Cyprus. The island's self-proclaimed ruler, Isaac Komnenos, a renegade Byzantine noble, seized the shipwrecked passengers and their treasure. When he refused to release them, he made a powerful enemy in Richard the Lionheart, who now had a new, unplanned battle to fight before he could even reach the Crusade. The storm that scattered Richard's fleet had, maybe without anyone realizing it at first, set the stage for another conquest. When Richard learned that the ruler of Cyprus, Isaac Komnenos, had imprisoned his shipwrecked soldiers and was actually holding his sister and future wife captive, his response was, well, swift and decisive. He saw Isaac's actions not just as an act of hostility, but as a direct challenge to his own honor. Arriving on the coast of Cyprus in early May of 1191, Richard immediately demanded the release of the prisoners and the return of their property. Isaac, arrogant and underestimating the English king's military prowess, flatly refused and even insulted him, daring him to come ashore and fight. This was a challenge Richard was more than willing to accept. He launched an immediate assault on the port of Limassol. His knights and soldiers, packed onto their transport ships, stormed the beaches in a surprise amphibious landing. The Cypriot forces, though they put up a fight, were quickly overwhelmed by the ferocity and discipline of Richard's crusaders. Isaac was forced to flee from the city, leaving Richard in control of the coast. The Lionheart had established a beachhead, and he was definitely not about to leave. He had come to rescue his family, but now he saw a strategic opportunity to secure a vital supply base for the crusade. Over the next few weeks, Richard systematically conquered the entire island. Isaac tried to negotiate, even swearing an oath of allegiance to Richard, but he broke his word and fled into the mountains to continue his resistance. This only hardened Richard's resolve. He pursued Isaac across the island, capturing his strongholds one by one. The campaign finally culminated in the capture of Kyrenia Castle, where Isaac's wife and daughter were taken. With his family in Richard's hands and his forces defeated, Isaac Komnenos finally surrendered unconditionally. Richard had him thrown into a dungeon in silver chains, a kind of mocking fulfillment of a promise not to bind him in iron. The conquest of Cyprus was, honestly, a remarkable and strategically brilliant achievement. It took Richard less than a month to secure the entire island. He celebrated his victory by marrying Berengaria of Navarre in Limassol, where she was also crowned Queen of England. The island itself became a crucial asset for the Crusaders. It was a rich and fertile land that would serve as a permanent, secure offshore base, providing a steady stream of supplies and reinforcements for the armies in the Holy Land. Richard eventually sold the island to the Knights Templar, but its conquest was a testament to his military genius and, really, his ability to turn a crisis into an advantage. While Richard was conquering Cyprus, the main Crusader army was locked in a desperate struggle before the walls of Acre. The siege had begun 2 years earlier, in 1189, led by Guy of Lusignan, the deposed king of Jerusalem. However, the situation had devolved into a bizarre and deadly stalemate. The Christian army besieging the Muslim garrison inside Acre found itself trapped, besieged in turn by Saladin's larger relief army, which had encircled their camp. For nearly 2 years the Crusaders were caught between the fortified city and Saladin's forces, suffering terribly from disease, starvation, and constant fighting. The arrival of Philip of France in April 1191 brought a much-needed boost to the Crusaders' morale and siege efforts. Philip brought fresh troops and powerful siege engines, and the assaults on Acre's walls intensified. However, it was the arrival of Richard the Lionheart in June that truly changed the dynamic of the siege. His fleet, laden with soldiers, supplies from Cyprus, and massive siege weapons, brought overwhelming force to bear. Richard, despite falling ill with a fever upon his arrival, directed the final phase of the assault from his sickbed, offering rewards to soldiers who dislodged stones from the city's walls. Under the combined pressure from the English and French forces, the defenses of Acre finally began to crumble. The relentless bombardment from trebuchets and the mining operations of siege engineers breached the formidable outer walls. The Muslim garrison, exhausted and with no hope of relief from Saladin, who was unable to break through the Crusader lines, finally surrendered on July 12, 1191. The fall of Acre was a massive victory for the Crusaders. It gave them a major port city and a strategic foothold from which to launch the rest of their campaign. But the celebration of this hard-won victory would be short-lived, as new conflicts erupted among the Christian leaders. After the city fell, the rivalries that had been simmering between the Crusader leaders exploded into the open. Richard Philip and Leopold V, Duke of Austria, all planted their banners on the conquered walls. According to chronicles, Richard's men tore down Leopold's banner, viewing him as a lesser noble and not on the same level as a king. This insult prompted Leopold to pack up his troops and leave the crusade in a rage. A month later, a more brutal event occurred. When Saladin delayed the prisoner exchange and ransom payment agreed upon in the surrender terms, an impatient Richard ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners. This cold-blooded act shocked both sides and led to Saladin executing his Christian captives in retaliation. With Acre secured but his alliances fracturing, Richard the Lionheart became the de facto commander of the Third Crusade. Shortly after the massacre of the prisoners, Philip II of France also departed, claiming ill health and urgent business back home, though many suspected he was more interested in preying on Richard's lands in his absence. Left in sole command, Richard knew he had to act decisively. His objective was clear: to march his army south along the coast to capture the port of Jaffa. Securing Jaffa was essential, as it would serve as the primary base for any future advance inland toward Jerusalem. The march south was a grueling test of discipline and endurance. Saladin, unable to risk another pitched battle after the loss of Acre, adopted a strategy of constant harassment. His swift Turkish horse archers and light cavalry shadowed the Crusader column day after day. They would ride in close, fire volleys of arrows into the tightly packed Christian ranks, and then retreat before a counterattack could be mounted. The Crusaders marched under a relentless sun, clad in heavy armor, with the sea on their right and Saladin's skirmishers on their left. Richard enforced strict discipline, forbidding his men from breaking formation to chase the elusive enemy, knowing that any break in the line could be disastrous. On September 7, 1191, near the forest of Arsuf, Saladin decided the time was right for a full-scale assault. He launched his entire army against the Crusader column, concentrating his attack on the rear guard, which was composed of the Knights Hospitaller. The Hospitallers were subjected to immense pressure, taking heavy casualties from the endless arrow fire. Their patience wore thin. Finally, against Richard's explicit orders, 2 of the knights broke formation and charged the enemy. This triggered the rest of the Hospitallers to follow, forcing Richard's hand. The disciplined march had just turned into a chaotic, full-blown battle. Richard's genius as a field commander shone through in that critical moment. Rather than panic, he recognized the opportunity. He immediately ordered a general charge, leading his elite knights in a thunderous counterattack that smashed into Saladin's forces, who were caught off guard by the sudden and ferocious assault. The battle was fierce but decisive. Richard's timely and powerful charge shattered Saladin's lines, forcing his army to break and flee the field. The Battle of Arsuf was a major victory for the Crusaders. It proved that Saladin's army could be beaten in open combat, shattered his aura of invincibility, and secured the path to Jaffa. After the victory at Arsuf, Richard successfully captured and refortified Jaffa, establishing the crucial base he needed for an assault on Jerusalem. The ultimate goal of the crusade finally seemed within reach. In the winter of 1191, Richard led his army inland, advancing towards the Holy City. However, the Crusaders were hampered by terrible weather. Cold, torrential rains turned the roads into a muddy quagmire, spoiling supplies and making progress incredibly slow. As they came within just 12 miles of Jerusalem, the army's leaders hesitated. They feared that even if they could take the city, they would be unable to hold it, as Saladin's main army was nearby and could easily cut their supply lines back to the coast. Reluctantly, Richard gave the order to turn back. This first failed attempt on Jerusalem was a bitter disappointment for the common soldiers, many of whom had endured years of hardship for the chance to pray in the Holy City. During this time of stalemate, a strange sort of chivalric respect grew between Richard and Saladin. They communicated through envoys, exchanging gifts and compliments even as their armies prepared to fight. In one famous, though perhaps legendary incident during a later battle, Saladin saw Richard's horse had been killed and, admiring his enemy's bravery, sent him 2 fresh Arabians as replacements. These moments stood in stark contrast to the brutal reality of the war they were waging. In the summer of 1192, Richard made a second advance toward Jerusalem. Once again, his army came within sight of the city, but the same strategic concerns remained. The summer heat was intense, water was scarce, and the risk of being trapped deep in enemy territory was too great. Richard, the brilliant military realist, understood that capturing Jerusalem would be a hollow victory if he could not hold it. The decision to retreat for a second time was agonizing, and it is said that Richard covered his face with his shield, declaring he was not worthy to look upon the city he could not free. While Richard was contemplating his next move, Saladin saw an opportunity. He launched a surprise attack on Jaffa, the city Richard had worked so hard to secure, and quickly recaptured it from its small Christian garrison. When news reached Richard, he acted with astonishing speed. He gathered a small force of knights and crossbowmen, boarded his ships, and sailed down the coast. Arriving at Jaffa, he saw the city had already fallen. Without hesitation, Richard and his knights waded ashore from their ships and led a heroic charge that retook the city from Saladin's surprised forces. A few days later, Saladin counterattacked, but Richard, commanding a tiny force on foot, managed to hold the line in a brilliant defensive stand, securing Jaffa one final time. The final desperate battle for Jaffa had exhausted both sides. Richard's small army was depleted, and he himself had fallen ill with fever. More pressingly, he had received urgent news from England that his brother John was plotting with King Philip of France to usurp his throne. He knew he could not remain in the Holy Land any longer. Saladin too was weary of the constant warfare. His emirs and soldiers were restless, and his treasury was drained. Though he had successfully defended Jerusalem, he had been unable to drive the Crusaders from the coast. The two great rivals, recognizing the stalemate, were finally ready to talk peace. Negotiations began in earnest, conducted through their envoys. The result was the Treaty of Jaffa, signed in September 1192. It was a compromise that reflected the reality on the ground. The treaty established a truce that was set to last for 3 years and 3 months. For Richard and the Crusaders, the terms were a partial victory. They would retain control of the coastal strip they had conquered, from Tyre down to Jaffa. This ensured that the reconstituted Kingdom of Jerusalem, though much smaller, would survive and have access to the sea. The city of Ascalon, a key fortress, was to have its fortifications demolished and remain unoccupied. For Saladin, the treaty was also a success. The main prize, Jerusalem, remained firmly under Muslim control. This was his greatest achievement and the fulfillment of his sacred vow. However, in a significant concession born of respect for the religious motivations of his foes, he agreed to allow unarmed Christian pilgrims safe passage to visit the holy sites in Jerusalem. This provision allowed the Crusaders to achieve one of their spiritual goals, even if their military objective of capturing the city had failed. The treaty was a pragmatic solution that brought an end to the years of bloodshed. With the treaty signed, the Third Crusade came to a close. Richard the Lionheart, after ensuring the safety of the pilgrims, set sail for home in October 1192, but his journey would be perilous. He was shipwrecked and eventually captured by his old enemy Duke Leopold of Austria, spending over a year in captivity before being ransomed. Saladin, the great unifier of Islam, would not live to see the truce expire. He died just 6 months later, in March 1193, and his vast empire soon fragmented due to infighting among his heirs. The Third Crusade, a story of epic battles and legendary leaders, ended not with a final victory, but with a respectful truce between two of history's greatest adversaries.